Hey guys, if you're building something in React, then there's a good chance you're going to need to use authentication to manage what users can and can't see. So in this tutorial, we're going to walk through how you can create an authentication wrapper and how you can keep some of your routes private. So what we're going to build is a simple website that has a home page and an about page, a login page where we can log in, hit enter, and then we have access to these private routes which show us some basic details. So before we get started, I'm just going to talk you through what we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to create an authentication wrapper for our app, which will allow us to manage in a stateful item whether a user is logged in or not. We're then going to add functions for logging in and logging out so that we can control that authentication. Then we're going to create a login page. We're going to add some private components that we only want logged in users to see. Then we're going to add those routes and menu options to our app. And then finally, we're going to walk through and test the application and make sure that you fully understand what's going on so that you can build one exactly the same. Now, I am assuming that you're familiar with React and creating components. I'm also going to assume that you've taken advantage of the useState, useReducer hooks and useContext hooks, and that you know how to use React Router. If you don't, check out the rest of the videos on my channel because I cover most of these items there. If you're semi-familiar, then you should be good to go because I will walk you through how we create each part of this app. So what we've got as a starting point is a very basic app that's using React Router. So we have the browser router component here. We're rendering a header, a menu, and our routes, which is what we can see on the front end. That's our header, our menu, and then depending on the path, which route we're showing. And at the moment, everything's public. The render header is very basic. The render page is just pulling at the moment the about page and the home page component. So again, very straightforward. The render navigation is a little more complicated because this is going to make our authentication job much easier. So I have a navigation object which is pulling through an array of objects that give us the path, the name for the menu, the element for React Router, and I'm saying is menu true or false. And that's just going to mean that we can use this one array of objects to manage the menu and the routes on the basis that some of our routes won't need menu options. For example, Logout. And then we have our render navigation component, and this is pulling through those nav items. And we have two components. One is to render the routes for our app. So again, we're just looping through and generating the routes dynamically. And then we have render menu, where we're checking that the object in navigation, if I just flick back, is menu is true, and if it is, it's outputting a menu item. And I've preset a lot of the CSS styles in here, but I'm sure you'll have no problem generating your own. So the first thing we want to do is to start at the top level and generate a wrapper for our app, and we'll call it the Auth Wrapper, that's going to hold all of our components and decide what the user can and cannot see. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just create a new directory, and we'll call it auth, and inside of there we'll create a new file and we'll call it auth wrapper.js. Now for this auth wrapper, we're going to take advantage of the useContext hook, which is going to mean that we have access to that context through our whole app to check if the user's logged in or authenticated, and any user details we want to store in that stateful item. So we will start off by saying const auth context equals create context. So we're going to automatically pull through the create context hook, and then we're going to export const auth data equals useContext, and then we're going to use the auth context that we've just created. Oh, there we go. Sorry, fat arrow. There we go. So we're using the create context, we're creating auth data, and that's going to use the auth context that we've created above. Now we can go ahead and export this as a component. So we're going to call it Auth Wrapper, fat arrow, and then we're going to create a stateful item to hold the details of our user, and we'll do all of this in one item. So we'll do user and set user equals useState, just import that in, and we'll set the defaults of the name to blank and the is authenticated to false for now. So within this stateful item, we're going to manage whether that user is logged in or not. We're not storing the name at the moment, but we are presetting that the authentication is currently false. And if we go down to the bottom, and we'll just do the return for the moment, useContext dot provider. So now we're providing this auth context to anything that's within, and we're going to say the value equals, and we'll pass through the user. There we go. And then the next thing we want to do inside of this return is to pull through the components that we've currently got in our app. So we've got render header, we've got render menu, and we've got render routes. There we go. Just hit save on that. And now we should be able to go back to our app, remove these child components, and import in our Auth Wrapper. There we go. So our app now is simply presetting the browser router so that we can take advantage of the routes inside, and we're outputting our Auth Wrapper. And the Auth Wrapper is providing the auth context we created at the top through to any child components of Auth Wrapper. And you could stick anything you want in here. In fact, you could create one component that encapsulates the header, the menu, and the routes if you really wanted to. The other things that we're going to want to export from this context are a couple of functions. The first one being to log the user in. So if we define the function for login, and logging is going to take a username and a password that we send through as arguments, and then we will return a promise, resolve or reject, and we can say for now if the password is equal to, we're just going to hard code the password for now, then set user, and we'll say that is the name is the username, and is authenticated true. So we're simply saying that if the password that's passed through is equal to password, then set the user as the name of username and is authenticated true, and then we'll just need to resolve that with, and we'll just say success. There we go. And then we could else, so if the password is not correct, then we will reject it, and we'll reject it with a message of incorrect password for now. So that's our login function, and we'll need one more function to log out, and we won't need to pass any arguments to that, and we can simply say set user name is back to nothing and is authenticated false. So we've got our login function, again taking a username and a password, checking that the password is correct, and this is really where you would want to hit an API to pull the user details to check. Once you've pulled that back and checked, if everything's right, resolve with success. If there's anything wrong, reject it with whatever the message should be. So we're saying incorrect password, it could be incorrect username, etc. The final thing we'll want to do to make these login and logout functions available through everything inside of our context is to export them. So we're going to export login and we're going to export logout. And that's it for our authentication wrapper. The next step is to create the login page so that we can control users trying to log into the system. So within Pages, we'll create a new file called login and we'll get started creating this page. So export const login, there we go, and let's go ahead and set the JSX for this to start with. So we're going to return, just taking advantage of the CSS I've already created. We'll have an h2 of login page, and then we'll have some inputs. Okay, so within here we're going to have a div with a class name of input, and then we can define our first input field. So we have input type equals text, and we'll copy that down and we'll have an input for our password. There we go. And then we'll need a button, so div equals button, and we can define a button with the text of login. Okay, so there's our basic JSX. In fact, what we could go ahead and do, we'll do the error. Actually, let's pop in a div with the class name of error, and we can pop an error message in there when we're ready. So this login function is going to need a state to manage the form data. So we'll say const form data set form data equals useState, so we can handle our input values there. In fact, let's use useReducer because we're going to be storing multiple items in the state, so useReducer is going to be a bit more helpful to us. And we'll pass the function in directly, and we'll set the default items to be username is nothing, and password, password is nothing. There we go. And then our function will take in the form data and the new item, and then we'll set in here the form data overridden by the new item. So we can simply go ahead now and say that the value of this input field is form data dot username, and on change equals set form data, and we'll pass through the username equals e.target.id. Oh, I'm not passing e through, so we'll pass e through. There we go. And then we should set the ID here of username. That should be e.target.value, sorry. And then we'll simply just copy that down to the password. Set an ID of password. The form data value is password, and we're updating the password, and we want a type of password. There we go. So that's our state and our input fields handled. Now once we click this login button, we're going to want to run the login function from our Auth Wrapper. So we should go ahead and import that in. So we'll import the login function equals auth data. So that's now given us access to this login function that we created that needs a username and password set. But we'll define our own function here of do login, and There we go. And that means that we can now set the on-click of our button there to on-click equals do login. And then when we do login, we are going to await, so we should make this function asynchronous. Await login, and we will pass it the form data.username and the form data.password. And then after logging in, we will want to navigate, so we're going to set const navigate equals useNavigate, and that's, if you don't already know, pulling through from React Router DOM, which is going to allow us to navigate the user to a different location, and we'll want to navigate them to the /account page, which we haven't created yet, but this is going to let the user see their account based on their username and password. Now we probably should wrap this in a try catch block, just in case we don't have the right password, because we'll get a rejection from that promise we created. So we can say catch, we'll set an error object in the state, so error message and set error message, and we'll set it to nothing for now. But if we get a rejection from that promise on the login function here of incorrect password, we can say set error message, and we can set that to whatever error was passed back. So with that error message set, we can now wrap our error div with, if there is an error message, then show the error message, else null. So if we get an error back, the error message is going to be displayed on the screen, and so we should output the error message inside of that div like so. And that's it for our login page. So just to recap, we're setting a state for, we're using useReducer to set the form data state based on the input values of the form. We're logging an error message if our login function, which we're importing from our auth data context, either is a success or a reject. If it's successful, it's navigating to the account page. If it's rejected, it's setting the error message and displaying it on the page. So with that now done, let's go and add this login page to our navigation. So we can simply add a new item in here that says path, and we'll say /login, name is login, and then we can say the element is the login page and is menu true. So we will want to, missing a comma there, so we will want to show this, another one, just tidied that up. So we're now defining a login page that's going to output to the menu, because we've set this as true, and show the login component when we're on /login. So with all that done, we should now be able to go ahead and test this form on the page. So if we flick back to the page itself, you can see we now have our login menu option. So we've got home, about, and login. And the login page is, if I flick back, displaying this form that we've created in the login component. So we could type anything random in, just type some random text and hit login, which doesn't equal password, therefore it's wrong, it's rejected, it's sent us back an error message of incorrect password. We set that in the state and we're displaying that. If instead I type password and hit login, it's going to redirect us to the /account page. So let's go ahead and create a component for our account page. Now we'll do this in the pages section, so I'll create a new file called account.js, and we'll go ahead and define our function here. So export const account equals and then this will be very simple. We'll need access to the user's information. So if I pop back to the Auth Wrapper, remember that we're exporting into the context the user from the state and the login and logout functions. So on our account page we can pull through the user, auth data, there we go, and then we can return div with a class name of page, and we can say your account, and we can pop in here, what should we do, we'll pop in there account name for example, and we could just simply pull the user.name, and that again is going to pull the stateful item of user that we're passing through and allow us to display the user's name. So if we hit save on that, the final thing we'll need to do before we can make access or have access to this account component is to add it to our navigation. So we'll now go ahead and say, if we land on /account and menu item name of account, show the element of account and is menu true. And what we'll actually do here is we'll need to set another item on these objects, which is private, and we'll say that for the account it is private, and we can say is private false, just to make sure everything's tidied up. Is private false, so these are all publicly accessible routes, is private false. So we've got the home page, the about page and the login page are set to false for is private, and we've got the account object as true for is private, because we only want people that are authenticated logging in. So again, we'll go and hit save, and we'll just check where we are with the app so far. Now you'll notice that at the moment, if I refresh the page, we'll be logged out. We've got the account showing, and if we click it, it's not showing any account name, because although we've set the page to be private, we're not handling that when we're outputting the menu items or the routes. But just to show you what's happening now, if we set the username to John and set password and hit login, it's saying account name John. So the actual authentication process is working perfectly. It's taking our username and password, matching that the password is equal to password, logging us in, setting the name, and authenticated is true, and on the account page it's showing us our username. But we now need to make sure that any of these private routes aren't shown in the menu or accessible unless we're authenticated. So if we flick back to the app, the way we're going to do this is we're going to go to the render navigation component, which handles both our routes and our menus, and we're going to add some conditioning to make sure that the route isn't defined if the user isn't logged in, so there's absolutely no chance of them getting access to it. So the first thing will be to pull in the user's information and status into the render routes component, and then so inside of our return we're going to map through the navigation items, and we'll just cut this out for a moment. There we go. And we're going to say if the route dot is private and the user dot is authenticated, then we can return the route. Else if it's private. So if the route is not private, then we can return the route, else return true, just to make sure we don't get any warnings. So that's going to make sure that if the route is private, that the user must be authenticated in order to show this route. And if the route is public, i.e. is not private, or is private is set to false, then that's fine. You can display the route. We'll now need to do the same with the render menu. So on the render menu, we're going to want to pull through the user and the logout functions, and we'll pull through auth data. So there we go. And just to speed things up, I'm going to paste the code I've already got written and walk you through what's happening here. So again, we're mapping through the nav items, and we're saying if the route's not private and it is a menu, remembering that from the navigation we're saying whether it's a menu item or not, and we'll come back to that in a second. Then output the menu item, and we'll just pull through. I've got a small component here to output the menu item. There we go, which is just returning the div with the link. Are we pulling through the link? Yes, we are in the React Router DOM. Else, if the user is authenticated and it's a menu item, then show that menu item. Else, return false. And then finally, we're saying if the user is authenticated, then show a logout button, which is going to run a logout function, which we're pulling through from our useContext, our auth data context component. Else, if the user is not logged in, show them the login link. So now that we're showing the login link manually, if the user is not logged in, we can go ahead in our navigation component and say on the login is menu false. And the reason we're doing that is that we'd only want to show the login page or the login menu option if the user's not logged in. If they're already logged in, we don't need to show them that option. In fact, we want to show them the log out option. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're looping through all of the navigation items and setting a menu item if it's is menu true. Login has is menu false, so we're not going to show that here, but we're going to manually show that menu item if depending on whether the user's logged in or not. So we can go ahead and save that. Finally, just to show this working, we'll go ahead and create one more page, and we'll call it private.js. And this is how you could then go ahead and add any other private routes. So we'll say export const private, and we'll simply return a page name equals page with an h2 text of private page and a paragraph of this is a members area page. So now we have this new private component. The final thing to do is we'll copy the account object, and we can say /private, the menu item name is private, the component is private, we'll import that in, is menu true, is private true, and hit save. Now I'm getting a few warnings down here because we've removed some components around, so I'm just going to quickly tidy up these warning messages. There we go. And now we should be able to go ahead and walk through the front end of this application and check everything's working. So if we flick back, we've got the home page, the about page, the login page. We can pop in the username of John and the password of password, hit login, which takes us to /account, and we can see the your account page and the account name of John. We've now, because we're authenticated, got both the account menu option that we're on and the private menu option. If we click that, private page, this is a members area page, because if you remember, we set in the navigation that this was a private page. And we have our logout button or our logout menu option, because in our render navigation we've got, if they're authenticated, show them the logout, and if they're not, show them the login. And the logout is the on-click for that menu option is to log out, which is the function we're pulling through from our auth data. And if we pop back to that, the logout function in the auth data or the auth wrapper is simply setting the username back to nothing and is authenticated false. You'll notice therefore if we hit the logout button, we'll no longer have access to this private page, and so nothing is shown. If we try and manually go to /account, again, nothing is shown because we're not authenticated. So in theory, the final thing for you to do would be to go into your auth wrapper and replace this login function with something that calls your API to pull the user's data so that you can check the password against live data from your database. Now, if you're looking for a great way to be able to create and generate hashed passwords and how to authenticate those hashed passwords for real live users, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, because the next video is going to cover a really great NPM package called bcrypt or bcrypt.js, which is the package that I use every time I want to handle usernames, passwords, and authenticating against hashed encrypted information. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please smash the thumbs up button, and if you want to see more tutorials like this, make sure you subscribe to this channel.